Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War News Update, third part there for the 13th of May 2024. Unlucky for some, but not for us lots. We are together as a team going through the geopolitical landscape, particularly concerning the war in Ukraine. Before I start, I just want to redirect people towards the Ukrainian Eurovision Song Contest song. I've listened to it about 19 times this morning. I freaking love it. It is brilliant. It is uplifting. That crescendo after the rap bit in the middle, where she builds to the crescendo and the crowd come in, it literally brings me to tears still every time I listen to it. Every time I've listened to it, I get tears in my eyes at that point. The incendiary munitions coming down in the background with the one of the singers climbing up that mountain against that is just evocative. It is freaking lush song. It does have religious undertones, if you translate the lyrics, but nonetheless, you know what I'm like. I love this song. I love it loads. I have. It's been listened to 2.5 million times in a single day, and about 2 million of them I think have come from me. Anyway, just go and watch it. It's just glorious. Love it. Right. We're going to really start with Slovakia. So Slovakia has become an intelligence black hole, according to the Centre for European Policy Analysis. They've written a piece on this, which we're going to dip into. Slovakia has marked its 20 years of full membership in NATO in March. It was not much of a party. Instead, the anniversary saw the country's allies starting to treat their notional partner, much as they do its neighbour Hungary, as a potential weak spot in the alliance. Following an election in autumn last year, narrowly won by a populist nationalist coalition, the new Slovak government has veered in a markedly Russia-friendly direction. This is true. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister, is not a fan of Ukraine and is a fan of Russia. They are a member of NATO, they're a member of the EU. This is much of a problem. A series of moves, most notably a cordial meeting between Russian and Slovak foreign ministers in March, prompted the Czech Republic, traditionally Slovakia's closest ally, to downgrade relations. More recently, the local media, citing unnamed Czech and NATO officials, have reported that Slovakia's Western partners are no longer sharing sensitive documents and intelligence with Slovak counterparts, so they're being left in the cold intelligence-wise. And for good security reasons, you don't want to share intelligence with Slovakia if they're best mates with Russia. It doesn't help that Slovakia's various intelligence agencies have long struggled to generate much confidence among their Western partners. In part, this stems from an unfortunate reputation they have acquired for prioritising the acquisition of political compromat over the protection of national or alliance interests. The main intelligence agencies, the Slovak Information Service, SIS, which handles domestic and foreign espionage, became politicised almost from the moment of its creation soon after independence in 1993. Its reputation is still scarred by scandals in the 1990s when it acted under the Kremlin-friendly Prime Minister Vladimir Messier, and it was widely believed to have been behind the kidnapping of then-President's son. Messier denies any involvement. The subsequent cover-up involved the murder of a police go-between. The SIS's then-chief, Ivan Alexa, fled to South Africa and was later extradited. Subsequent criminal cases against him, were stymied by amnesties issued by Messier. Later, SIS leaders have enjoyed considerably higher public profiles than one might expect for people in their line of work. Take the current de facto chief of the SIS, Pavel Gaspar. He was installed via a legal workaround after President Zuzana Kapitova. So she's the outgoing president, who was from the Greens, I think. She is pro-West. She should technically appoint the agency's director, and she expressed doubts about that's Gaspar's thin resume, reports about his unexplained wealth, and previous threats to kill a prosecutor did not help. In Slovakia, Gaspar is known mainly for an elaborate tattoo on his forearm depicting his father, Tibor, a controversial former police chief who, since being elected as an MP for the governing Smear party in September, steered through Parliament a law change that will drastically reduce statutes of limitations and sentences in public sector corruption cases. So we are seeing democratic backsliding in Slovakia, like we've seen in Hungary, in terms of judiciary, in terms of changing the laws to favour essentially here people getting away with corruption. In Hungary we've seen The media largely under control of the state. And now we have an MP, Gaspar Senior, who is changing the rules concerning Gaspar Junior, who's in charge of the intelligence services. And Gaspar Senior is himself currently facing serious criminal charges, changing the rules on you're doing people for corruption is crazy. He also sits on a parliamentary committee seeking to hold the intelligence services, most notably the one now being run by his son, to account. So the son is supposedly being held to account and his activities as in charge of the SIS by his father. Interesting that. Father and son declare that their relationship will not affect their duties. Of course not, of course not. Two previous leaders of the SIS also currently stand accused of corruption and alleged attempts to interfere in high-profile police investigations. So the fact that the government is changing the rules so not to be able to hold people to account, for previous corruption so much is all incredibly dodgy. Anyway, lots more to talk about in there that just is not good news. I'm going to rejoin the article much later. Somewhat, but I'd advise reading this. It's fascinating. Somewhat improbably, Slovakia's other neighbour Austria has lately provided additional diversions. The Alpine country's normally prim image has been tainted by a series of increasingly baroque intelligence scandals attesting to widespread Russian influence there. Although not a NATO member, a highly secret signals intelligence encryption device used by the alliance was reportedly passed to Russian intelligence from Austria, along with secure phones belonging to top government officials. A former intelligence and police official allegedly commissioned by Wirecard fugitive and Russian asset Jan Marsalek was arrested in early April. I detailed that whole Wirecard and encryption device scandal in a previous video some time ago. As for Slovakia, recent events have marked something of a return to the past. The reason why Slovakia has marked 20 years of NATO membership this year and not 25 years like its Central European neighbours is that Messier and his allies were so distrusted by the West. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright memorably described Slovakia under Messier as a, quote, a black hole in the heart of Europe. So they spent 5 years not being able to get into NATO because of their dodginess. The country has since entered all the major European clubs like the EU and the Eurozone, but is now gambling much of the hard-won trust that got it there. At the risk of self-inflicted political irrelevance and growing distance from the European mainstream, Slovakia seems to be achieving very little in terms of national political gain. And I hope that, there are some protests in Slovakia against the current government and the direction they're taking, similar to what we're seeing in Georgia, although not nearly as big, but there have been protests there, as we've seen in Hungary as well. And just on top of that, Bloomberg has written, Bloomberg and the FT, Financial Times, have written pieces on the Russians plotting attacks in Europe. Timothy Myrilovanov here, who is president of the Kiev School of Economics and Minister of Economy in Ukraine previously, he's writing about this. Now, the FT title is Russia Plotting Sabotage Across Europe, Intelligence Agencies Warn. Assessment suggests Kremlin agents preparing court bombings, arson and attacks on infrastructure. I talked about this at depth in the Tochny, not that particular thing, but the subject as a whole in the Tochny video, the live stream last night. I came on at about 1 hour 15 minutes once I got my microphone sorted. So you can go and watch from then. We had a good couple of hours of really stimulating conversation, talking about whether we're in World War III and what does it mean to be attacked with cyber warfare and intelligence disinformation attacks. Like, should we be recognizing more formally that we are in World War III, etc., etc.? Really sort of big level conversations there. And, this is kind of pertinent to that discussion. Russia is plotting attacks. These are attacks on Europe. This is, I would state, this is war. Anyway, Milovanov talks about a number of different examples. Let's go through some of these examples just to get people realizing what Russia is doing. An arson attack in March 2024 on an East London warehouse containing aid shipments for Ukraine. 2 men charged of being accused of working for the Russian government. An explosion in April 2024 at a BAE Systems factory in South Wales that manufactures arms sent to Ukraine. Still no idea of exactly what went on there. A fire in April 2024 at a General Dynamics plant in Pennsylvania that makes artillery shells being sent to Ukraine. Still no, these could well be be Russian connected to Russia. A fire in May 2024 at a factory near Berlin run by a firm making air defense systems supplied to Ukraine. Although that's steel defense, I think that was an automotive industry site. 2 German-Russian men arrested in Bavaria in April 2024 for allegedly plotting to attack military and logistics sites in Germany on behalf of Russia. A series of train derailments in Sweden in 2024 that are being investigated as potential acts of state-backed sabotage. Alleged Russian attempts to destroy signalling systems in Czech railways, as reported by the Czech Transport Minister. Attacks on the Estonian Interior Minister's car and those of journalists in February 2024 perpetrated by Russian intelligence operatives, according to Estonian security services. Russian cyber attack on members of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's party carried out by APT-28, a group controlled by Russian military intelligence. Russian jamming that has impacted hundreds of civilian flights in Europe, especially over the Baltic states, Poland and Scandinavia. Alleged Russian cyber attacks on Britain's Electoral Commission and the Royal Family's website. In addition, I've been briefed on another 3 attacks to cyber warfare and 1 intelligence mapping that are not public, says Milovanov. But why does Russia do it? What's the point of jamming GPS for flights over Baltics? They are testing the capabilities and look for vulnerabilities in NATO defences. They want to know what works, the strengths and weaknesses of the defence against hybrid operations. I quote the Financial Times, quote, "As ever with Russia, it's wise not to look at a single explanation of why they're doing anything. There's always a combination of things going on. These pinprick attacks we've seen so far are, of course, to create disruption, but they can also be used for disinformation. And then there is what Russia learns from these attacks if they want to immobilize Europe for real. They are practice runs." And there's a new piece by The Economist that lists a number of additional incidents. The piece is Russia is ramping up sabotage across Europe. Unexplained explosions at Bulgarian arms factories in 2015, 2020 and 2022. I have heard of them from Ukrainian agencies who were convinced that it was Russian sabotage. Well, now that's pretty much a done deal that it was. In fact, we know the group that was responsible for one of those. I'm sure it's a group that stayed in that quasi-Russian hotel guest house in North Greece run by 2 Russian agents, effectively. According to Google Mandiant report in April 2024, Russian-linked hacktivist groups claim to have manipulated control systems for water utilities in America and Poland, and they thought was a hydroelectric facility in France. In March 2024, an ally of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was attacked with a hammer in Vilnius, Lithuania. I've also heard of massive non-fatal poisoning of tens or hundreds of Russian opposition activists in Berlin last year, and multiple symbolic and false flag operation attacks on monuments as well. So there's just a picture of the sort of activity, pro-Russian activity, that's taking place across Europe and indeed America. What do our public know about this? Do they realize we're in the middle of a hybrid warfare with Russia? I think we're in World War III, and I think our population needs to know about that. Okay, a great comment here from a Dutch person, H. Aruva, I presume. Hi, Jonathan. Some updates about the formation of our new government. So I was talking about Mark Rutte, who's still the leader in the Netherlands because they haven't formed a coalition yet. If you remember, with many countries in Europe, you've got proportional representation. So you have a lot of smaller parties that better represent individual voters rather than just throwing everyone into 2 parties, say in the US and less so in the UK. We were starting to get to a multi-party platform. But if you've only got 2 parties and you have a whole wide variety of views, then 1 party out of 2 or 2 parties are not going to represent you. So that's apart from dictatorship, that's the poorest form of representation. So it's better to have many parties, but of course the problem with that is that you then don't have a majority party a party that gets a majority votes. So you'll very rarely have over 50% of the vote by any party. So you then have to form coalitions to get over the 50% mark so you can have a ruling party. And what that can mean with the Netherlands is it can take an awful long time, especially when you have a really divisive person or party that has won a lot of the votes. So in the Dutch case, you've got PVV and Geert Wilders, who is extremely right wing, and a populist party that got the most votes, but no one really wants to go into coalition with them. So there's been lots of compromises, and we are still months down the road after the election and still not looking like a coalition being formed in the near future. However, So that's your preamble. One, since there's no new government yet, Mark Rutte will be the demissionaire Prime Minister of Netherlands. So he takes on the role by default. Rutte has the support of all countries but three to become the new head of NATO. So he's heavily touted to be the new NATO head after Jens Stoltenberg. It is expected Romania will withdraw its candidate soon, and Orban will be the only one delaying the process of appointing the new head of NATO. Who knew? Would Mark Rutte become the new head of NATO? He cannot stay demissionaire Prime Minister, so obviously he would then not be that Prime Minister. It's not publicly known who would take his place, but it is expected the four coalition parties will form a new government in time, and that will include PVV. So I was saying it probably won't earlier on in the discussions, but that's because of Wilders. So here's the interesting development I wasn't aware about. All four parties agreed the new party leaders will not become the new Prime Minister. So of those four parties, the party leaders of them will not become Prime Minister. That means Geert Wilders will not become Prime Minister, but stay on as party leader. So he'll be PVV party leader, but not Prime Minister. Wilders still needs to suggest who could become the new Prime Minister. And all the four parties have to agree on that. So it could still be a PVV leader, which is going to be on the far right. But what this means is that there is compromise. We've already seen Geert Wilders' PVV and Geert Wilders himself say, we're not going to go out of the EU. We're not going to do a Nexit, a Netherlands exit like Brexit. And he said, because look what happened with Britain, Britain's not in a good place. Interestingly, OECD have just released a report of all G7 countries, and guess who's going to make the worst economic progress in their predictions of all those 7 countries? It's the UK. We are not looking particularly economically strong. There's been some reports recently. I was watching an analysis on the News Agents, which is a great podcast, and elsewhere actually another podcast talking about and getting some authors on from who are like experts on Brexit. There's a guy that's written, like, he's got his 4th book on Brexit coming out on like what has happened, like historical analysis. And say what you like, I know I've got a lot of people who are really strongly Leave voters. I was a strong Remainer. Economically speaking, we are in a bit of trouble, and the new rules coming in, we are looking to add loads of bureaucracy and cost that is going to hit predominantly medium and small businesses. So at the moment, we've already had a lot of those going out of business or having to move to Europe because of red tape going into Europe. And now the UK naturally has to have red tape coming out of Europe. And you can't just say we should do away with trade deals because we are necessarily part of the WTO. And so we have to put World Trade Organization agreements in for stuff coming out of Europe. Of course, we all used to be in that, and there's frictionless trade going both ways there. As soon as you come out of Europe, you've got friction going in and you've got friction coming out. And there are all sorts of issues with that. And it is costing importers and it's costing exporters. So this is why when I was doing public debates and talks on Brexit, I was like, the Leave campaign cannot win the economic argument. It's literally impossible. Like, you can say what you like, but the reality is, if you are an inward investor and you want to invest into UK, you are going to not set up in the UK because you had set up to get free access to 70 million, but you have to pay to access 500 million people. So you'd much rather set up in Europe to access 500 million people free and frictionless trade, and then pay tariffs to access 70 million people. This is always going to happen. So the only way you can get people, attract people to UK, is if you completely slash workers' rights, environmental rights, give them tax breaks, which means you're not going to get in the income that you should, etc., etc. So, like, whichever way you look at it, you can't win, and for lots of other reasons, you can't win the economic argument for Brexit. So you have to win it on things like immigration, etc., etc. Now, what that means, so to come back to this, is that Geert Wilders has changed the direction of the PVV to say, actually, we're not anti-leaving the EU because it's not a good idea. And that's just fascinating, because you've got a really heavy, essentially pro-Brexiteer saying Brexit didn't really work for the UK, so we're not going to do that. Wow. But anyway, the other three coalition parties Wilders need to form a majority to form a government have had a great impact on most of Wilders' key issues. Hence, the PVV pre-election is not the PVV it currently is anymore. They had to agree with keeping up support for Ukraine, for instance, and as mentioned, they've changed on Brexit to some degree, or Nexit. So Euroscepticism is not so hardcore. Ukraine skepticism not so hardcore. Otherwise, talks would be of the table that he would never be able to get a majority. So this is a de facto argument for coalitions because they temper the extremes of any party that wants to get in, because you are always, unless you are if you're the extreme party this way, the extreme party that way, you're tempered by the other coalition partners. You're always going to be tempered by someone the other side of you. So even if you're the centrist party, you're tempering the extremist party you're in coalition with, but the extremist party is actually bringing you somewhat. So your centrist extremes, if you like, are getting. So there's always compromise in coalitions, and that is actually generally a positive thing. So it just stops the country going in a wildly problematic direction that would happen if you got a single party in who were extreme, right? Anyway, thank you for that. He says, I am not a Wilders fan, but our democracy is being well protected against the opinions of one party. It's exactly what I'm saying. I'm not worried about Wilders or the PVV. The Netherlands will always support Ukraine. Slava Ukraini. Really interesting. Thank you for that. Ukraine's First Lady and Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, visits Serbia for the first time. So these are one of the countries like Slovakia, but outside the EU, but very much in the sphere of influence of Russia, signalling a pivot in Serbian alliances away from Russia towards Western engagement, according to Reuters. I wouldn't go so far. We'll see if anything comes out from that, but Serbia are very much, as I say, in the sphere of influence of Russia, but also China, and it's not looking good there. Poland have cancelled negotiations scheduled for May the 14th with Ukraine regarding the export of grain due to accusations of corruption by the Minister of Agricultural Policy, Solsky. So Solsky is a Ukrainian agricultural minister being accused of corruption by the Polish here. Now, pay attention to this. So this was pronounced by the Deputy Minister of Agriculture of Poland, Michał Kołodziejczak. He was a chap that when Ukraine went to Poland to sort out issues of trade, he had a right old rant and stopped any negotiations and was really counterproductive. And there are arguments as to what his agenda is. So now further negotiations have been cancelled due to this same guy. So this might say more about him than it says about the Minister of Agricultural Policy in Ukraine. He states, the deputy minister in Poland, negotiations with Kiev are interrupted because we will not negotiate with people accused of corruption. Now, whether that is a genuine issue of corruption or whether he is doing the bidding of others, I don't know. Germany's rejected the idea of creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which could be implemented by NATO. Quote, we rejected that at the time, and I think the same applies to the different requests that are now being made, a government spokesperson said. This is coming from The Guardian Live. There's no more detail about this, but it seems to be that NATO, because there was talk about this right at the beginning of the war, that there should be a no-fly zone over parts of Ukraine or all of Ukraine, and that should be enforced by NATO, and then it was poo-poo, but there's no official line on it, I don't think. But Germany appeared to have been, we rejected that at the time, and think the same applies to the different requests that are now being made. So there are evidently still requests being made about that, and Germany are still poo-pooing that. I wonder which countries were in favour and are in favour of that. Ukraine's number one courier postal service, so Nova Pochta, I've been to Nova Pochta post offices, opened its first branch in the UK. Nice little video here from their creative team. Now it's easier for UK charities to get aid to Ukraine. Interesting how there are some successes for Ukraine in terms of, economic, financial, corporate successes. So I guess good on them, on the one hand. Good stuff. That's great. On the other hand, protect our own British postal services. But there you go. I say that, and we've got UPS delivering stuff all around the UK, and they're American. So yeah, go for it. Good luck. So that's interesting. Right, we're going to move on to Georgia now, and I think the rest of this is on Georgia. So riot police have moved against Georgian foreign influence bill protesters. I have been talking to you the last few days about where does this go, because the Georgia Dream ruling administration have a choice that either to go hard on the protesters or to not go hard. It's either carrot or stick. And I think they're going to go stick. And if they go stick, will that make the protesters protest even more? I don't know what's going to happen here, but they have gone hard. And it's really horrible to see. But there are just seething masses of black clad policemen who are taking individuals. Here they are beating. We'll come to that in a second. But ruling party MPs, so Georgia Dream MPs, sneaked into the parliament while Georgian police were brutally beating protesters with unimaginable cruelty. It took the Legal Affairs Committee only 67 seconds to review the Russian law in its third hearing. It then goes to the vote, and the third vote today. The third plenary hearing is scheduled for tomorrow, which is today. So they nipped in, got that all done in 67 seconds while people were having the crap kicked out of them. Pro-Russian government in Georgia has also ordered its police to attack the Democratic protesters outside Parliament this morning as they pass a foreign agents law. Outside the Georgian Parliament building, the police are going nuts. More video from Georgia where police are beating up and detaining peaceful protesters. It's horrible imagery coming out of Georgia. It really is. Now here's one of someone being just on the floor, being stamped and kicked repeatedly. Even though this Georgian protester is inertly lying on the ground, Russian puppet government goons beat him anyway. This is going to be the new reality for Georgia if they don't get the Russians out now, says Jay in Kiev. And in fact, that person they're beating, this is from another angle, this is the guy who was beaten then, is lying prostrate. Is horrible. Crowd of security forces in Georgia brutally beat a detained protester, after which he is passed through the so-called corridor, where on the way to the paddy wagon he is kicked and beaten. It's amazing when someone gets dragged away, and there's another one of someone getting dragged away, as this one, horribly dragged away, and you see these arms coming over as everyone wants to get a punch in on them. It's just horrific stuff. I don't like it. I'm starting to feel that things in Georgia can turn out the same as how Maidan started back in 2013, says Noel reports. The entire world must see what freedom fighters in Georgia are going through. The real nature of the politicized entity formerly known as the police, now used to suppress protests, says Nodor Rukajte. And you have the police thugs as well, not just the official policemen, but the other people who are employed to kind of thuggishly beat people on behalf of the police. It's not cool. And everyone, of course, is in balaclavas and you can't tell who they are as policemen. There's no identification of them. It's not looking good in Georgia, but hopefully that will inspire the protesters to go to protest even more and see a greater reaction against such brutality. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care. Thanks so much for your support and speak to you soon.